Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Back with us today is Dr. Al Kertz of Anthill LLC, and our topic is dairy health or dairy calf health in automated feeding systems. Welcome, Dr. Kertz. Nice to see you again.
It's good to be back and to be inside rather than outside right now since it's over
Oh,
100 heat
my
index. So,
goodness. That makes
yeah.
new challenges too for dairy farmers, doesn't
Oh,
it? I
yeah,
mean, when you've
yeah.
got those heat.
And we
Oh,
talked about that a couple of presentations ago about the heat stress on calves.
mm-hmm.
But today we want to talk about the auto feeder situation relative to health of calves. If we look at the last National Animal Health Monitoring Survey, it was published in 2014, which means that it was a year or two before that the data were actually collected. So those data are about 10 years old. They showed that about 70% of calves were in individual housing, either inside or outside. Now, it's very likely that has diminished as there are more group housing and feeding facilities that have been constructed. So that's a topic that is of interest to a lot of dairy operations is how well does that work and how do we manage that? So a large scale study was done in a large dairy farm in the upper Midwest. And in the paper, they talked about some of the advantages that generally accrue to group feeding and housing: a flexible labor schedule, a labor savings, less labor. Um, Milk delivery can be in various volumes and frequencies, not just at a set time, and delivering uh, milk to calves in predetermined portions at various intervals. So you have all of those flexibilities. Now, a major question is whether when you commingle or group calves, you can increase the incidence of disease or infection from one to another. That's always been an overhanging cloud in this area. So, in this case, what they did was they looked at the data from this large herd to try to get an idea about when the calves are sick, are they more sick? Does that affect their feeding behavior? How can you determine what it is? And so that was really the purpose of this evaluation on this large dairy. The dairy had 2,500 hosting cows. They were in the upper Midwest, and the data were collected over a year from May 2018 to May 2019. And during that year, there were 763 heifer calves were enrolled in the study, and a group in a group pen consisted of 15 calves with an age difference that did not exceed 7 days. And of course, the larger the dairy, the easier, in a sense, it is to get those size groups with a narrower age range. And then calves remained in the same group throughout the period. So there weren't calves leaving and calves coming in during the time. That always seems to be better too, because you have a stable social situation when the calves are all the same throughout the period. Okay, then they did a lot of monitoring. Um, Pasteurized colostrum was fed initially within 6 hours of birth, followed by 2 liters of milk replacer, fed twice a day for the initial 7 days. And then they were moved into groups. Um, they were fed combination half milk and half milk replacer initially in order to have a transition, and that's always good to do. There were 5 liters daily allowed during the up to 6.5 liters during the first 7 days. So there was another transition there. They allowed gradual increasing from 6.5 to 7.5 liters daily over a 14-day period. And then finally, they peaked at 9 liters daily at day 35. and that was maintained for 18 days. And then the weaning began at day 46, stepping down about 9/10 of a liter per day over a 10-day period. As we've talked about before, it's important to have a good weaning transition period so that there's adequate starter intake, so that there's not a slump or a drop off after weaning. In this case, though, there was no starter intake recorded. It was a pelleted starter fed free choice in a feed bunk, and then there was a water trough nearby. Now, calves were housed in 11 by 11 meter pens, so that's roughly 30 by 30 feet. And they had what?
Al, I just want to interrupt you for a sec. I think your paper might be over your camera.
Oh,
Oh, there we go. We can see you. Thank you.
okay. Sorry,
No
I
worries.
forgot all about that. Okay. Okay, cows were housed in about 30 by 30 feet or 11 by 11 meters. They had 3.7 meters of non-bedded area up front, and then they were bedded during the summer with straw or during the winter with straw during the winter and sawdust during the summer. Okay, ventilation was provided by a combination of tubes, exhaust fans, and side curtains, so you had good ventilation. They kept a number of daily feeding behavior measurements, such as rewarded visits. So if the calf went there and it was had an allotment left, they could drink. So that would be a rewarded visit. If the calf went there and there was an allotted amount, but it did not drink, that's an unrewarded visit. Or if it went there and it was not allowed, didn't have an allotment, that would be unrewarded. So then the time was calculated of each visit. The amount of milk allowed per visit was recorded. The milk consumed was recorded. And then from that, you could get a drinking speed calculated. And then a sudden withdrawal was also recorded. So from that, various observations were calculated. The total milk intake in milliliters per day, the average intake per visit, the drinking speed, the interval between visits, the duration of the visit in minutes, the number of rewarded visits, number of unrewarded visits, and then the calf age whenever health scores were assessed and found to be a problem. So now if we look at that table more closely, we see that the mean for total milk intake per day was a little over 6 liters, 6,446 milliliters. Now that's a good number, but notice that the standard deviation is quite high, 2.3 liters, and the maximum was 10, almost 11 liters. So there's a lot of variation in that average of intake. And the amount then you see was about 1.8 liters per visit. And again, you look at the standard deviation, it's close to a third of the mean, and the range was quite high. It went all the way up to 3,000. Now, the drinking speed then was about 800 milliliters per minute, but look at the variation again, 330 standard deviation for milliliters, and the drinking speed was all the way up to 1.85 liters. So that's a pretty wide range again. Interval between minutes was about 142 minutes, so a little over 2 hours between visits, 125 minutes standard deviation, so a very wide latitude there. In one case, the minimum was only 14 minutes between feeding. In other cases, it was almost up to 1,000 minutes. So a lot of range again. The duration in terms of minutes was only about 1.8. But notice that's the average. So the standard deviation is quite high. It's over 3. And then if you look at the range, it went all the way up to 10. Now the age and days of the calves are 38 and a half. Average, that was the mean, and the standard deviation 15.9, and a wide range of 3 to 75 days. So in total, there were almost 600 calves that had feeding behavior analyzed, and that represented about 3,000 calf scores with 1,892 healthy and 1,100 sick calves. There were only 3.5 visits per day. I thought they would be higher, but that's really all that there were. About almost a kilogram or 970 grams of dry matter intake was the average for milk or milk replacer. So that's high, but not unreasonable. And the full milk allowance intake was 38 and a half days. And remember, after that, shortly after that is when they started decreasing in order to lead into the weaning transition period. And as milk intake increased, calves being sick decreased. So what that tells us is that when a calf was getting sick, it started eating less, drinking less milk, which is what we might expect. So the slower the milk intake was also associated with sick calves. So that's a case where you could monitor the system and the data available to look at maybe a ceiling or a floor for the speed at which calves were eating. If they're below a certain point, then you could flag that and take a look at that calf and see if it's starting to get sick before it really has an outbreak of either scours or a respiratory problem. At high drinking speeds, there was very little problem with the calves. The increased intervals between feeder visits was also associated with sick calves. So not only did they drink less when they were sick, but they drinking speed are drinking less at each visit, but the time between visits was less. And of course, you might expect older calves had an increased incidence of sickness than younger calves. I I mean that's what happened, but I was surprised by that because I thought if you look at NOMS data and studies, that most of the time the drinking when calves have a respiratory problem, it occurs in the first couple of weeks, as does the problem with scouring or diarrhea. But in this case, they saw this at older ages. And of course, there's some limitations to any study. And one of the things that the authors point out was they only did this on a single dairy, but it was a large dairy, so I had a lot of data. And that allows it to calculate a lot of things. Another study cited was done with more smaller dairies. So they had some different results because they were more smaller dairies. Now, group size can also impact a feeding situation. And in this case, they maintained a group size of no more than 15, had an average range of 7 days. And in the other study cited, the group size was about 18 calves, but there were a wider range of age spread, and they, in some cases, calves come and go into and out of groups as well. So these results show that it is possible to use the feeding data to look at the sick propensity for calves because they're likely to show this before they're visibly obvious that they're getting sick. So that was a big plus for this study to sort through that. So the bottom line is this study was done over a year on a large dairy, had a lot of good data, and it found that calves that were beginning to get sick did affect their interval between feeding. It got wider, and that they drank at a slower speed and drank less, whereas older cows had an increased incidence of sickness in this case than the younger calves did. And of course, this is done on auto feeders and data they generated along with weekly disease scoring for an individual. But it shows what's possible for managing a dairy.
So I want to remind everyone who's tuning in here that if you have any questions, to please post those over in the chat, or if you're joining us from social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, you can certainly post those right directly in that social media channel that you're watching us from. So Al, we talked at the beginning briefly about how hot it is, and you're gonna talk about automated feeders and kind of monitoring for disease and being able to tell a little bit, maybe a little earlier, when a calf might be getting sick. But might there also be some environmental influences that come into play when you're looking at the automated feeding system data, like if it's super hot or other factors?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why you'd have to take that into account when you're looking at it. When it gets more hot and humid, their activity of the calves decreases. They're not going to have as much of an appetite. We know that from cows. Of course, cows have fully functioning rumens, and it depends how functional the calves' rumens are, whether they start eating less starter, because that increases rumen fermentation and heat production. So in this case, there was no starter intake, so we weren't able to take a look at that. But certainly the seasonal effects are going to be obvious. We would expect that they could or should eat more during the wintertime and less during the summer when the weather's hot. And if the ventilation's not good, that would be another factor. In this case, it seemed like this was a very good, well-ventilated facility.
Is there a general rule? So you're looking at this data and you say, okay, I've got decreased consumption for a day, 2 days, 3 days. Where should you start to say, okay, what might be wrong? Is it after a few days, or is it immediately you should really start looking into what the situation might be?
If there was a cutoff that you had established based on what you've seen with your calves, and if their interval is below a certain or longer than a certain average that you've had, or they're eating less, or the speed is less, you should be able to flag that data for that calf. And then I would go take a look at that calf, and you look to see if it's starting to have a runny nose or respiratory problem, or is it starting to have looseness in the feces and the manure. And so you could see whether the calf is getting sick before it would otherwise be obvious for you visually. And then you would check that calf out and treat it there, rather than wait for another couple days when it gets bad and then the calf has a longer recovery period. There have been some other studies done where they put activity monitors on calves' feet, and they find a similar thing, that when the calves begin to get sick, their activity decreases. So in this case, you're using their intake as an indicator of less activity, and they are not feeling as well.
So when you're looking at these automated feeding systems, I'm assuming there's a number of them out there. What should a producer, how should they evaluate those as to what might be best for their operation?
Ooh, that gets really sticky, and I'm not well
In
versed on
general.
all the different equipment,
Okay.
but I think that this is the sort of thing that you want to look at is, okay, what data is collected and how can I use that data and how can I flag it to help me make decisions? And then, of course, you always want to have good service for whatever system you're using.
Any final thoughts on the topic, Al?
No, I think it sheds a lot of light on it and says that we can use these data from this kind of a system to help us better monitor and manage calves, particularly for sickness.
So you can find Dr. Kertz's column on this topic on our website on feedstuffs.com. So if you want to check that out, sorry we didn't get a chance to post a link here today, but it is on the website. I want to thank you, Dr. Kertz, for joining us. We appreciate it as always. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Likewise, we appreciate all of you joining and tuning in. We know you have busy schedules, so we appreciate you giving a little bit of your day to us. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format at feedstuffs365.com, and that would include those heat stress sessions that we mentioned at the top of the hour here. So you might want to check those out if you have want some more information on that area. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.